What research or findings have come out in that last 2 years that have really got you excited?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that I've really locked onto. One is a fairly recent report from one of the mobile phone companies, which monitored when people log off at night and when they log off in the morning. And it was a study over, and I got the data here, over from 2020 to 2024. So just 5 years. But the connecting times in the morning haven't changed much. What's very interesting is that the disconnecting times in the evening have. So people are turning off their phones about 20 minutes earlier than they were 5 years ago. Now, I think that's fascinating because maybe the message is finally getting out there that you've got to defend your sleep. I suspect it's probably Generation Z, because they are the group who are drinking less, they're exercising more, they're eating well. So I think it's all part and parcel of a realization that sleep is one of the pillars of health, and they're embracing it. So that's been exciting. In fact, I was asked what are my New Year resolutions, and I said to be more like Generation Z. To be more like my kids, who are very well behaved, certainly compared to my generation. So that's good. The second was a recent paper, and we've often sort of said that alcohol and sleeping tablets don't provide a biological mimic for sleep. They in fact can harm some of the important things. Alcohol is classic. Memory consolidation, the processing of information can be really badly affected. But this new data suggests that sleeping tablets, things like Ambien, for example, can actually disrupt what's been called the glymphatic system. Now, the glymphatic system is a fairly recently discovered system within the brain that clears toxins. It's sort of like a bit like the lymphatic system. And one of the things it gets rid of is beta amyloid, which is a misfolded protein, and has been associated with dementia and Alzheimer's. And so the use, and it's really fascinating because the use of some sleeping tablets has been linked to a higher risk of dementia. So there seems to be an interesting link. It's early days yet, but another really important role for sleep, of course, is to get rid of these misfolded proteins. And trying to fool the brain that it's getting sleep by using sedatives or alcohol seems to actually disrupt yet another component of one of the reasons why we need to sleep, and that's the clearance of toxins. So I think there are some of the two new things. We've got one more area which I think is interesting, in that our politicians are taking sleep a little bit more seriously. So we've got the Great Parliamentary Sleep Survey. And so Lord Tom Watson in the House of Lords has sort of sponsored this. And we developed with a bunch of people, both in Oxford and in Norwich, some questionnaires for our Parliament, both members of the House of Commons and House of Lords. So this will be the first time we'll have got a sleep assessment of our members of Parliament. And I think the data are going to be really interesting. And we're trying to get an announcement from the Houses of Parliament, I think sometime in April, May. So watch this space. See how sleep deprived or not our leaders are.
Wow. Now that's a very, very interesting point. And I'm sure everyone will be looking into that. What are you expecting to find from that?
Well, I think there's such a lot of machismo in many politicians that it's part of the throwback to the 1980s, where people would come into and say, oh well, I haven't slept again all night, and oh well done, pat on the back, how heroic. And of course the realization that this is absolutely a disaster. I think so there is a machismo probably embedded within some members of Parliament. I think it's a lot better than it was. But also, I think in fairness to them, and the ones I know do work jolly hard, and they have lots and lots of stuff imposed upon them, and their desks are rarely empty. And so I think maybe it'll be depending upon the results, I suspect they won't be getting the sleep that they need. We may be wanting to cut them a bit of slack and say, look, we want you to make sensible, well-informed, well-considered decisions. So we'd like you to protect your sleep a bit more. Maybe they are, I don't know, but my suspicion is that they're not.
I remember reading Nick Clegg's book when it came out, and he was talking about his time serving in the coalition, and he was talking about the amount of work that he used to take home with him in the night, and he said that he'd be doing his day-to-day job, and this pile of papers would stack up and up, things he had to just sign. So it's quite the sort of menial tasks, and he would leave all that work, and then when he clocked out at the end of the day, he would take it home with him to do on the sofa in front of the TV. And he said he would be signing away on these papers late into the night. And he said he'd be falling asleep at, 1, 2, 3 a.m. and back into work the next morning. And it does make you worry there's a world leader getting a significant lack of sleep we then trust to make the biggest decisions in the world.
Well, I completely agree. And I thought that the sort of the financial crash of, what was it, 2008? Bankers are another classic example of really sleep deprived group. And what does that what does that deliver? Impulsivity, failure to process information accurately. And I hope that we are trending away from the sort of, it's a badge of honor not to get the sleep that you need. And people are embracing it. And I think that's why those phone records are so interesting. Yeah. And maybe more of us will be like, and I'm assuming it's Generation Z, because they're the sensible ones. I think that we'll hopefully become a bit more like Generation Z.
Yeah. And are we going to, is there any more data to come out on that to actually tell us, some reasons why that number is going down? If it is Generation Z, will we find out?
No, it's basically a huge survey of average log on, log off. Okay. So, there's, and it's only, as I say, over 5 years, but the data, I was really surprised that it was a clear 20 minutes on average. And the trend was, quite sort of significant. So that's pleasing. And it would be good if we got some follow up on that. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Well, what would you put that down to? Because obviously, I think it's undeniable that the subject of sleep has really come into the mainstream in the last couple of years through books like yours. It's been a massive topic on podcasts, and all this health and wellness and personal development that seems to be tripping in more and more into the mainstream. Is that what you put this figure down to? Just a general sort of waking up to this subject? No pun intended.
Yes, I think so. But I still think there's an awful lot to do in that educational space. And it just stuns me that we have no formal education in our schools and in a sense in our colleges as well about the importance of sleep. We should be embedding this information along with sexual health and all the other aspects of health. And we've actually done some projects where we've worked with teachers and indeed parents to develop just educational tools to advise, kids about why it's important to defend sleep, the usual stuff, turning your devices off and all those sorts of things. And we're able to show that in those 20% of kids showing really poor sleep, after the education, the average moved away, and there was a significant improvement with education alone. And so I think that was a good pilot set of data, which suggests we should be making this as part of the national curriculum. I don't understand why it isn't, because it is so important now. So that's one area. I think another area where education is really important, and that's in the workplace and in night shift workers. Now, so, and I'm not sure if we discussed this last time, Lewis, but I think for night shift workers, yes, it would be naive of me and anybody else to say we're not going to, have 24/7 and we're not going to have night shift work. Our, frontline nursing staff, police, ambulance crews, all, are going to have night shift work. But what can we do about it? What can we do to mitigate? And I think there's a really important area of education. So, if you know that you're going to lose vigilance on the drive home after the night shift, and there was a study showing that 57% of junior doctors, these are anaesthetists, after the night shift, 57% had either had a crash or a near miss driving home. And so we need to sort of advise them to use these simple apps you can put on your phone to detect head nod or lateral movement of the car to wake yourself up. And of course, high-end cars have that kind of technology built in. But that's something very straightforward. We know that there's poor mental and physical health in our night shift workers. High rates of type 2 diabetes, obesity, depression. And so what we should be doing is having higher frequency health checks. And so you can catch these things before they become chronic and they can then be managed. Other things in terms of education, knowing that there's a greater risk of type 2 diabetes, obesity, metabolic abnormalities. What kind of food are we making available to our night shift workers? It's as bad as it could be. High fat, high sugar, vending machines full of Snickers bars and all the rest of it. And so what's bizarre when we have such a robust food industry in this country that nobody's taken on board, we can get nutritious, high protein, easy to digest snacks for our night shift workers. I'd love to see a Great British Bake Off or some other program on the telly whereby they try and develop something that would be highly nutritious, easy to digest, and lower the risk of some of these conditions. Going back to education, it's not simply the individual who's on the night shift, but it's the people he or she shares their lives with. So in some cases, the divorce rate can be 6 times higher for night shift workers compared to day shift workers doing the same job. And the whole family or the whole unit needs to be aware that this person hasn't turned into a monster. This is kind of a consequence of driving your biology outside of its normal range. And you've got to find ways of discussing this and not just getting really angry with your partner. So those are the sorts of things that I think that education could be incredibly powerful. And that's why I'm excited about the Great Parliamentary Sleep Survey, because I think it'll raise the profile even further and we can start to think about some ways of mitigating.
There's so much I want to unpack there, but on the parliamentary stuff, so there might be people out there right now, they're very cynical towards politicians. They may be thinking, I don't care how much sleep they have, but get
people to write to their politicians and say, I hope you filled in the survey. That would be better.
Yeah. So just so people understand then the impact of it, if we're using politicians as an example, what is the hard evidence on how sleep affects things like decision making and cognition and all these things that would be good traits for a politician to have?
So there we have the data. And one of the great things, when I was able to write Lifetime, I put the references, the primary scientific sources in the book. So now this will make people not buy it, but there were 920 citations in the book, which is great. And Penguin were fine. They said, we want the science there. And it's in small notation, but you can probably access most of this information. And so when, there's a big table showing, the acute impact of lack of sleep on emotional, cognitive, and physiological health, each point has a scientific reference associated with it. So going back to your point, fluctuations in mood, irritability, anxiety, loss of empathy, the failure to pick up those signals from others that you should be working with, risk-taking and impulsivity. I think that's extraordinary. And the tired brain says, I can make it through those traffic lights before they turn red.
Yeah.
But the brain that is not tired would use its high cognitive ability and sort of say, no. And it really doesn't matter. Just calm down and stop when it's red. Why would you risk it for a few seconds? It's just bizarre. And I think one of the other really interesting areas is what's called negative salience. And there's some lovely data that came out of Germany and the United States, actually, showing that the tired brain remembered negative experiences, but forgot the positive ones. So one's whole world view was based upon the negative things that you remembered.
Yeah.
And so, that's, I think, so important. And then, of course, there's a tendency to sort of overstimulate during the day. And I don't remember what Nick Clegg said in his book, but whether he was driving the waking day on caffeine, as many people do, and then thinking, crikey, I've got to get up in a few hours' time. I've got to sedate myself, and then sort of reversing that stimulation with things like alcohol or sleeping tablets. And we've already touched on the problems of doing that. So those are some of the key areas that we want our politicians to be, really finely tuned. And if we think about cognition, multitasking, this I think is a really interesting one. So when we're tired, we can't extract what's important from all the other stuff that's coming in. So it's very difficult to multitask. And so, we want our politicians who are, bombarded with a mass of stuff to select what's important, focus on that, resolve it, and then move on to the next thing. Concentration, their ability to, I had a wonderful expression the other day. This individual gets so little sleep, they have an attention span like a ferret on a double espresso, which was, I think, very evocative. Communication skills, decision-making skills, creativity and productivity, the ability to come up with new ideas. Another study, I thought was a fantastic one, and I'll go into the detail because it's such a lovely study. And it was quite a hard task to perform. And so individuals were introduced to the task, made familiar with it in the morning, and then one group had to perform it that afternoon. And only about 20% of the group solved the problem. Hard task. Next group introduced in the morning, became familiar with the task, but then performed it the following afternoon, but had no sleep at all. And again, about 20% of the group solved the problem. And of course, the interesting group is introduced in the morning, performed it the following afternoon, full night of sleep, 60 to 70% of the group solved the problem. And that's such an important, I think, illustration that it's not just simply about laying down facts. When we're asleep, we're coming up with novel solutions to complex problems. And crikey, do we ever need to be able to do that at the moment? So yes, embrace your sleep.
Amazing. Well, it's interesting, as you were saying there, about negativity. There's this quote by Nietzsche that is, I think it says, when we're tired, we're attacked by ideas we conquered long ago. And this idea that, issues we thought that we passed and got past, all this negativity tends to come back to us. We're in a sleep deprived state. So based on what you were saying there, that Nietzsche seems to have some sense on that one.
I've never been a particular fan of Nietzsche, but I think I might steal that quote.
Yeah, seems to go hand in hand.
It does. It's very good. Yeah, he was an interesting chap.
Well, in James Clear's book, Atomic Habits, he says your problems adjust to their true level of importance after a hard workout or a good night's sleep. So with that in mind, there's this common saying that you should never go to sleep if you've got an unresolved issue or a conflict with your partner. Never go to sleep on an argument. So would it maybe be more effective if we did go to sleep on an argument and addressed it in the morning?
No, because that will cause anxiety and stress, and as we touched on before, that most people don't have a sleep problem. They have an anxiety or a stress problem, and it's all about winding down and getting rid of those demons, so that your brain isn't in a state of flux, isn't work. I think it's very interesting. I was talking to somebody about this recently about why exercise is good, and this was in the context of, how do we re-correct ourselves after the excesses of Christmas? And one of the things that occurred to me is that what we've been doing over the holiday period is being fed to. We've sat in front of the telly. We haven't really interacted. We haven't sat back and thought for ourselves much. It's been essentially, the brain has been in responsive mode. And I think one of the great advantages, certainly when I was a swimmer, a competitive swimmer, doing my 80 lengths or whatever it was, you could then, I just had some great ideas. I could just go into automatic mode and then just think. And I think it's making place, however you want to do it, to think. whether it's during exercise, whether it's listening to a piece of music. But I think we really must make more room in our lives just to step back and think, and that will also help our sleep, and of course it'll help our brain resolve some of those sorts of things that are lurking at the back there that we can then deal with.
When you were saying there about, bringing ourselves to a place of calm and getting rid of that stress and anxiety before sleep, It made me think that one thing I've often tried to do before bed, in place of the TV, is read. And I found lately that the effectiveness of that depends on what I'm reading.
Oh, so gosh, yes.
I'll admit, I read a lot of very nerdy high fantasy books. So Lord of the Rings, Wheel of Time, all this stuff, and great adventures. But I'm starting to wonder if, telling my brain these stories of these grand action-packed adventures before bed might not actually be the best way to wind down.
I think you've got to try a whole variety of things. For some people, that might work really well. They're going to an alternative space so far from reality that might be really usul and refreshing. So it could have a role. I mean, if I wake up in the early hours of the morning, yes, I do read, but I never read science. I never read my area. It'll be history or something like that. But I love listening to Radio 4 Extra, and I'll catch up on a play, an Agatha Christie play. I know what the solution will be, but it's gentle, it's calm. Or Lord Peter Wimsey, or one of those sorts of things. I mean, Melvin Bragg in our time. I mean, I really enjoy the program, but in the early hours of the morning, it has a very the description of the importance of Chinese porcelain really is so unthreatening. I find it a great way to relax and go to sleep. And it's interesting that, and I don't mean this disrespectfully because it's a great program, but so many people tune into In Our Time in the early hours of the morning as a way of falling to sleep, and then they'll catch up with it, later the next day.
Is there any, and obviously you're not conscious to it, but is there anything to suggest that you should be trying to fall asleep in silence as opposed to maybe having the radio on or having some earphones in, listening to ASMR or something relaxing?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and it will vary enormously. Some people, need white noise, and if they're living in a noisy environment, I mean, a student dorm, for example, then white noise, has been thought to be a good idea. There is an argument that if you're listening to information, that may not be quite so helpful, because when you're asleep, you're shutting out visual and auditory information, and so the brain has then the capacity to concentrate on what it needs to do, memory consolidation, playing with information. And I don't think the evidence is very good, but there's one argument that you may not want to have high information content for getting off to sleep. Darkness, I think, is very important, because light can increase levels of alertness and make it more difficult to get to sleep. I think there is some nice data. I was looking at this fairly recently about artificial light at night, Alan, and we have, very clear evidence that it's not doing insects and bats and some other species much good. But the evidence in humans is not as strong. But there were some studies that have looked at women who kept their lights on at night, and it showed that they had higher rates of coronary heart disease, higher rates of blood pressure, and higher rates of type 2 diabetes. Now, these are, I think that the studies could have been done better, but I think it would make sense not to leave the lights on for those reasons. But I think there's no hard and fast rules. It's all about what works for you, and it's so many people bandy around the word. It's quality of sleep, not quantity, and that's quite right. But what do we mean by quality? And that's utterly subjective. Do you wake up in the morning feeling refreshed, and if you've had a good night of sleep? Do you need an alarm clock to wake you up? I mean, do you feel irritable? Do you need caffeine to keep you going? These are all telling you probably not have the quality of sleep that you as an individual need. But there is no golden magical number. There are broad ranges, but what's frustrated me about the field of sleep is that people will take a mass of data, they'll slap an average on it, and then they'll say, this is what you should do. And there was a paper that came out a few years ago on sleep in the elderly, I think in 70-year-olds. I'm fast approaching 70, so I won't say elderly. I think in those people, of middle age. And it was interesting because they said, yeah, you should get 7 hours of sleep. But what they hadn't assessed is the health status of those individuals. So if you slept more than 7 hours or less than 7 hours, your life expectancy was down. But as I say, many people will not be sleepy, but they'll have fatigue. But they'll report that as poor sleep. And fatigue is a signature of poor health. So they may have already been ill with fatigue and expressing fatigue. And of course, shortened sleep is often associated with health conditions, so pain or other issues. And so I think just slapping an average, say, oh yeah, you've got to get 7 hours, just generates anxiety. My dear old mum, she said she'd never had better sleep until after she retired. She didn't have to worry about children so much. There was, jobs and all those sorts of things. And we were told very firmly not to call before 11 o'clock in the morning. She had the sleep that she wanted. So her sleep quality may not have been what you'd read as perfect, but it worked for her. She had a great sense of humor.
Yeah, amazing. Well, as you were talking there, and you were talking about light, my mind was going back to our first conversation where, you were telling me something, sort of not debunking, but addressing one of the myths that there's not so much science around. And this is something I found really interesting, and I went away and started trying to look into it because it's such a common technique that a lot of science communicators, a lot of podcasters talk about. Some try to sell their own version of it. I'm talking about blue light blocking glasses. Now, I think when I first became interested in sleep, I read a very popular book on the subject, which I won't name. But this book sort of glorified blue light blocking glasses. And I remember reading the book and thinking, these things are the answers to all my sleep problems. And I bought them. I bought different versions of them. I was walking around the house in them. My parents thought I was mad when I was younger wearing these around the house. And then when I started to read your book and we had a conversation and I've started looking up since, there seems to be actually very little evidence that they do anything.
Absolutely. I've just gone through the literature again because I've just completed the first draft of a new book on light, all the way from its formation in the sun. And most people don't know how light is formed. And I have to say, I thought I did, but I didn't know fully. All the way through, vitamin D synthesis, skin cancer, vision, photosynthesis, the most important biochemical reaction on the planet, all of that sort of stuff, all the way through to architecture. But there is a section on blue light and in fact red light. There are chapters and the psychology of these colors. But I went through the literature again, and there is no evidence that blue blocking yellow glasses have any effect at all. In the same way, it was a very nice, asking about new studies. Nice study in young adults on using what's it called? I think it's called screen shift. It's on iPhones and things like that, which shift from blue enriched screens to, and it's the same as F-Lux for, and they compared the having the switch on or off, and it had no effect whatsoever. And the other thing that I think has emerged since we last talked, and I think this is really fascinating, is that I probably went on about the Kindle studies, which showed that, or reported to show that if you look at a Kindle before you go to bed, you'll delay your sleep onset. Well, just to refresh your memory, I mean, what they did was keep people in relatively dim light during the day. This is all lab-based studies. Then they had 4 hours of Kindle use on its brightest intensity on 5 consecutive nights. And at the end of that, they just showed statistically significantly sleep was delayed by 9 to 10 minutes. And of course, as one of my colleagues said when this data was presented, well, it may be statistically significant, but that's biologically meaningless. So anyway, that's where we were last time I think we chatted. But very interestingly, more recent studies have shown that if you expose people to reasonable levels of light during the day, and this is only around about 500 lux, excuse me, which is not that bright. I mean, go out in the morning and you'll get 10,000 lux easily. But if you had moderate levels of light during the day, any effects of a Kindle use were completely abolished. And so what seems to be happening is that we've got, this is a really important point, I think, is that if you can't necessarily extract well-controlled lab experiments to the field, if these individuals had had moderate levels of light during the day, their clock would not have been sensitized to light, even in a minor way, in the evening. So if you're getting, so it's really important because, of course, light is doing loads of things. It's setting the clock to the external world. But now we know that moderate levels of light during the day, which is why you should get out and have your sandwiches outside, even in the winter, as if you wrap up warm, can influence the sensitivity of the clock in the evening. So we're just beginning to understand the really dynamic nature of light and how it interacts with the circadian and the sleep systems.
Incredible. So where do you think the obsession, the idea came from then and became so popularized that these things actually help?
Oh, yeah. Well, you see, we discovered these new photoreceptors in the eye, these new light sensors in the eye. And we did this, first of all, in mice, showing that mice with hereditary retinal disorders, whereby their visual cells had degenerated, could still regulate their clocks perfectly normally. And we discovered that there's another light sensing system within the eye. And those receptors are maximally sensitive in the blue part of the spectrum. To be technical, 480 nanometers, which is the blue of a perfectly blue sky. And so, people jumped on this and said, right, if we block blue light, we're not going to shift the clock in the evening, or we're going to reduce these, alertness and stuff like that. And so it was based upon the scientific concept, but it wasn't actually tested in practice. It's turned out to be much more complicated. We thought originally that the rods and the cones, the visual cells, didn't interact with these photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, these new receptors, but it turns out that they do under certain circumstances. Sometimes they can even inhibit them, but we don't fully understand those interactions. And so people became obsessed with blue light. And a whole bunch of products were designed accordingly. And I read them endlessly in magazines or travel brochures or whatever. And it drives me crazy. I think it's a failure to appreciate the biology of light as well. Because, okay, these receptors may be maximally sensitive in the blue part of the spectrum, but the response is like a bell-shaped curve. So it will absorb an awful lot of light either side of blue as well. And so it's not, if the light is bright enough, it doesn't matter what the color or the wavelength is. And so I think there's been a lot of confusion about this, and it's not been helped by some of my colleagues who don't frankly understand the biology and the nature of light, which is why I'm writing this new book. It's fascinating. I mean, my background, as an undergraduate, I was doing photoreceptor biology, and that was my PhD work. And so I've come from a light background, and it drives me completely crazy when, just to give you a sense, and there are so many papers published in this way. Light is often measured using lux meters. And I would urge your listeners to download a lux meter onto their smartphone, because then you can get a sense of how much light we are not exposed to in our built environments. It's quite fascinating, go to the middle of the room, go to the window, go outside. But a lux meter has a spectral response. It doesn't absorb all colors, all wavelengths equally. And again, it's a bell-shaped curve peaking in the sort of greeny part of the spectrum. But what people have done is they've said, right, we're going to use the same amount of photons, the same amount of different colors of light, and look at the response of humans. They've measured it using a lux meter, which of course is completely wrong because it's more sensitive to some colors than others. So to get what you're doing then is because it's not very sensitive in the blue, you turn up the amount of blue light to get the same level of reading, and then you're comparing it to far less of a more red shifted color. So it's a comparison of apples and oranges. And I am ashamed to say that there are many papers out there, and I make myself sometimes unpopular by pointing this out, which have used completely the wrong units. It's depressing. Yes. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant. I apologize. I apologize, Lewis.
No, this is incredible. This is incredible. I think this is really important because one of my bugbears around, anything health related is when an idea becomes popularized that just so happens to be linked to something that can be sold to someone. And I hate when people are given false hope or sold, through.
I agree. I very, very rarely ever lose my temper because it's just bad form. But I did on one occasion where there was a group of people selling this headset-like device, these sort of ear plugs, which would pour light into the brain. And these were described as curing SAD, as curing jet lag, and all of this. They sold loads of them. I mean, they must have made a fortune because these little light buds were like 120 quid each. And this was scandalous. And they could do it. And because it wasn't a medical device, they could get away with it. But I haven't seen them advertised recently, so I think they've finally moved on. Another nonsense device, which bugged me for years, was some studies that came out of a university in the States, claiming that if you illuminated behind the knee, you could shift the biological clock. Now, this was published in Science, one of the top scientific magazines. And those of us who worked in this area thought this is nonsense, because if you don't have any eyes, you can't regulate your clock. But this was cited as one of the great papers of the year, and those of us were saying, well, hang on, let's just be a bit calm here, because it doesn't fit with anything we understand. And there was an idea that basically light behind the knee would excite the formation of nitric oxide. Nitric oxide was known to shift the body clock in the brain, but let's just say it did produce nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide lasts within the blood for a fraction of a second, so there's no way it could actually get to the brain. And so Philips, the manufacturer, started patenting devices for aircrafts that you'd sit there with your knees exposed or the light behind me. And so these things surface from time to time. Now, we laugh, but there were a couple of things that brought this home to me. So one was I was privileged to go and teach in India. In fact, I'm going to be going there in March to do some other part of a summer school. It's just a joy to go there. And one lad came up to me and he said, "Oh yeah, it's really exciting. I'm doing my PhD on, the effects of light behind the knee on shifting the clock." And he's a bright kid, but was not aware of, hadn't gone to the sort of the Western meetings, and was unaware that everybody thought this is just nonsense, and had the, limited resources, really bright, but squandering those, that intelligence on a project that couldn't possibly work. And I think that made me move from this is just kind of daft to actually irresponsible. And in fact, I had a grant in the early days when we were looking for these new photoreceptors in the eye. And this was in about 1998, 99. And, one of the referees, we didn't get the grant because they said, well, why is Foster looking for new photoreceptors in the eye when we know those photoreceptors are behind the knee? And it really was breathtaking. And I think it's so important for your listeners to really dig into the science as much as they possibly can. And that's why I was so pleased that Lifetime had all those references in. And it's taking the science and making it accessible. And I don't think we do enough of that. And I have to say, some of my colleagues don't make the situation any easier.
No, they definitely don't. And another sort of technique that I see a lot of people going towards and throwing their money at, there's all these products you can buy them off the shelf in the supermarket, these gummies, and people describe melatonin as the sleep hormone.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because melatonin seems to be something people are obsessed with in this space.
They are, and I've been banging on about this for a long time. So what do we know about melatonin? It's this neurohormone produced in the pineal gland, which is a pea-sized gland in the middle of the brain. In fact, René Descartes thought that the pineal was the seat of the soul. Because it was the only unpaired structure in the brain. It was right in the middle, so he got excited about all of that. We found out in the 50s it was producing what was called melatonin, because it would make the melanophores of frog skin white. So that's how it got its name, melatonin, from the melanophores, the pigment cells of frog skin. And the reason it was looked at is because they thought they wanted to deal with skin pigmentation issues. So that's part of its history. So what we know is that in anticipation of darkness, the melatonin starts to rise. It peaks around about 4 o'clock in the morning, and then declines in anticipation. It declines in anticipation of dawn. So it mirrors darkness. And importantly, it mirrors the length of darkness. So during the winter months, the melatonin profile increases, and during the summer months and spring, it decreases. Now, that's fundamentally important to seasonally breeding sheep, deer, all of those sorts of animals. And so the reason why there's the rut in the autumn is that the melatonin profile has expanded. That's a biological measure of increased night length. The animals breed, the gestation is over the winter, the young arrive in the spring when there's lots of grass for the mums to make milk, and then to wean the youngsters. So the biology of melatonin in terms of seasonally breeding mammals is beautifully clear. That's been noted. Okay, what else? Well, because it sort of mirrors sleep, people thought, well, it must be a sleep hormone. Now, there's a lot of evidence to suggest, yes, it's a mild modulator of sleep, but it is emphatically not a sleep hormone. So people, for example, on beta blockers, and I'm sure some of your listeners will be on beta blockers, they have, that reduces hugely levels of melatonin. But the sleep-wake of people on beta blockers isn't significantly different from those who are not on beta blockers. There are people who, there was a study which suggested that quadriplegic individuals where the spinal cord had been severed had terrible sleep. And it was said, well, because the nervous connections to the pineal have been broken, they can't produce pineal melatonin, therefore that's why their sleep is so bad. Then they compared quadriplegics with paraplegics who have a break in the spine much lower down, but they have normal patterns of melatonin, and they were exactly the same. So it was an artifact of being confined to a wheelchair or the other horrors of having those conditions. So what about the scientific trials? Well, they've been very variable. Sometimes there has been no effect at all, but the study which showed the greatest effect is that if you take, I forget the amount, but let's say something like 3 milligrams, 2 milligrams of melatonin shortly before bedtime, it will reduce the time it takes to get to sleep by about 10 to 20 minutes. So whilst it may modulate sleep, it is not a driver of sleep. We know that there are melatonin receptors in the master clock in the brain, the suprachiasmatic nuclei. And so one idea, and I think it's the one that I favor, is that it's a modulator of the effects of light. So light comes in, sets the clock, so internal day aligned to external day. The SCN, the master clock, then regulates the pineal, and the pineal produces a dark signal, which then reinforces the light signal. Mm-hmm. So it's a modulator, but it is not a driver of sleep. And, you read endlessly that, if you wake up and you turn the lights on, you're going to suppress melatonin, which you will if it's long enough and bright enough, and that will then mean you're more alert. Well, the time it takes to suppress melatonin and get it out of circulation, the effects on alertness have already happened. So it's not a melatonin effect. It's a direct neural connection. So yeah, no matter how many journalists I speak to, I say, look, please don't call it a sleep hormone. It's a modulator. The other thing that's become very fashionable, of course, are these cannabinoids, these jellies, which are thought to reduce anxiety and make it easier to sleep. Interestingly, there's a bit of data that supports that. They may, we're still early days, but it looks as though they may help some people. The other thing that's surfacing and rumbling around, but we need more data, is magnesium. Taking a magnesium supplement has, in some people, been indicated to improve sleep. Problem with all these studies is the controls, the expectations, it's really tricky. But I'm not dismissing it at this stage. And I'm not saying that melatonin has no effect. It does have an effect, but you can't call it a sleep hormone.
Yeah. Well, I think it's amazing. And I think it's so important that people realize that, this science is there to go and look at. As you mentioned, all the references. I think it's so important for people to do a little bit of hard work themselves rather than just take everything at face value.
I think that's right. But, that many people, depend upon how they get their information, in a sense, and they trust people like myself. I hope, and we should do the best job we possibly can at making sure that the statements we make are as accurate as possible. And I think whether it's selling a device or a book or whatever, there's fast and loose talk, and I just go back to the point I made earlier, which is, sure, I think you can trust most people, but always take everything with a pinch of salt. Yeah. The thing that when we brought up the kids, we constantly asked them to ask the question why. Now, they did, drove their teachers crazy, drove us crazy, but I think that questioning is so important, and not to simply accept, but to question, say, well, hang on, what's the evidence for that? Show me the data. And I think we should all be asking those questions of everybody, in fact, about any subject, not just the sciences that we've been talking about.
Well, in that vein, one thing I did want to ask for some science on is, sleep seems to be becoming very gamified lately. There's a lot of these devices out there that'll give you a metric, and a lot of people become obsessed with these metrics, like sleep ratings out of 100, and your score should be between 90 and 100, and you can compare your score with your friends and people of the average similar age to you, where you rank in the world. And one of my friends, Dr. Andrew Steele, did a video once where he wore 3 different sleep trackers from 3 different brands over the course of a week, and he wore them all on his wrist at once. And come the end of the week, they all gave him completely different results.
That's what I'd expect.
What can we expect from these sleep trackers? Is there any substance to them, or should we just not really pay our money and time into them?
What can we expect? Bugger all. I'm sorry, but so where to start? Okay. They should work. In the sense that if you want to lose weight, you change your eating behavior, you weigh yourself in the morning, and you see, oh, I've lost weight, and that reinforces your changed behavior. If you want to get more sleep, for example, or a different timing of sleep, these devices could be really quite powerful. And the sorts of devices we use just measure acceleration. So we know when a person's active and when they're not, and we use the raw data. And that's really good for knowing when you went to sleep roughly, if you woke up in the night, and when you finally woke up in the morning. That's great. The problem is these devices use algorithms to try and extract how much REM sleep or slow wave sleep you've had. And you simply can't do it with the existing technology. And the other thing, of course, is they're developed using a single algorithm. And I was called up by one of the papers and said, look, there's this new sleep tracker, and it says it's been medically validated. And I said, okay, before you go any further, let me guess. It was 12 undergraduates in California, and they were for what was it, 5 days in a sleep lab. And they said, well, that's close. It was 5 undergraduates in a sleep lab for 2 days. And so what they're trying to do is extract from movement and temperature a very complicated behavior, which is sleep. And, you can't do that. I do feel that going forward with AI and increased technology, we will get sleep trackers that are intelligent. So, of course, the sleep of a 25-year-old, a 22-year-old is going to be completely different in that individual when they're 30, 50, 70. So our individual sleep changes. And it changes enormously because of chronotype, whether you're a morning type or an evening type or whatever. So for one algorithm to fit all is simply, it won't work. I mean, I remember quite a few years ago, one of the sleep trackers contacted us and they said, look, we want to work with you. We want to validate our equipment with you. I thought, this is fantastic. So we had bioengineers in the team and I said, what do I need to sort of get from these people? And they said, well, you've got to get the nature of the algorithm and you've got to get the raw data. And so I said, right. And so there was an agreement drawn up between this company and University of Oxford, and we kept on saying, oh, we need the raw data, or, we need the algorithm. And one of my friends from Munich said to me, yeah, you're never going to get it. And I said, oh, I think I will. I have a piece of paper saying that they will deliver this information. So, and he said, I bet you they won't. And I said, I bet you a really good bottle of whiskey that we will get those data. Anyway, I had to give him a really good bottle of whiskey. So whilst they start to engage with the scientific community, they back off pretty quickly because they realize the limitations of the device. So I think at the moment, most can give you a crude approximation of sleep. And the most important thing is not to feel anxious about them. Yeah. I had one chap who came up to me. Well, several people have come up to me. The most memorable was a chap saying, I don't think I'm getting any slow wave sleep. And I said, well, how do you know? And he said, well, my tracker's saying I just don't get any slow wave sleep. And I said, well, they're really inaccurate. I wouldn't worry about it. He said, no. I set the alarm clock for 3 o'clock in the morning to wake myself up to check how much slow wave sleep my device has measured. And so I know that's an extreme example, but it's an illustration of how anxiety making this inaccurate information can be. And I think people, and the marketing model for these is really fascinating because people have bad sleep. They say, what do I do about it? You buy a pair of blue blocking glasses or you buy a sleep tracker and you use it for 6 months and you shove it in the drawer because you realize it's just giving you nonsense. And of course, there's a complete cycling as people, come through, they buy their device, they stick it in the drawer, the next people come along, buy the. And a good mate of mine, Ken Wright, who's at the University of Colorado, he has big classes on sleep. And he asks the class, he said, who here has ever used a sleep tracker? And these are kids of 22, 23. And in a sense, all the hands in the class go up. And he said, who now is using the same tracker? And about 3 hands go up. And I think it's a great illustration, and he told that story a few years ago, of the fact that people learn pretty quickly that they're not very good. I should say there was a paper published fairly recently showing that there was a particular tracker, I forget which one it was, that had been tested on university students. And it showed about an 80% concordance with, electroencephalogram defined sleep. And so many of us said, yeah, well, you'd expect that because these trackers were developed in young people. Show me how it works in a 60-year-old or a 30-year-old. So, first of all, I don't think 80% concordance is good. It's okay. And secondly, you've got to test on a variety of people. And as I say, I think going forward, AI could be very powerful, where we get better ways of measuring our biology, feeding back and tweaking the algorithm to your particular sleep behaviors.
Yeah, and as you were saying, I'm very adverse to using any sort of trackers, like health trackers. I used to use one that would monitor my heart rate and things like that throughout the day. I do a lot of sports, and I remember there was this time where I convinced myself I had like a really high heart rate, and I was getting really anxious about it. And I was checking, and I went to the doctor and I said, "This thing is telling me my heart rate is higher than it should be, and I'm checking it all the time." And she said, "I can't see anything wrong with you. What I think is happening is because you're so anxious about that number constantly being accessible to you that it's keeping your heart rate high." She said, "There's a setting on the watch," she said, "where you can turn the display off." So she said, turn the display off and then have a look in a week at your average heart rate. So you can't check it throughout the week until the end of the week. Lo and behold, the number was a lot lower come the end of the week when I wasn't constantly checking it.
What a very wise GP. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example, and I might use that example too. But it really is illustration of that. You've really got to rely on your own assessment, about your sleep, and to stop relying. We know when we've had a good night's sleep. We know roughly what you've got to do and how to change it. It's just behavioral modification. We don't need a half-assed device to mislead us. And I think you've illustrated that beautifully.
Brilliant. Well, Russell, this has been an absolutely, amazing hour. I've thoroughly enjoyed speaking to you. I always do. I thank you so much for coming on the show once again. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I hope we get to do this many, many more times, and we get to keep talking about the new research that's coming out and the new research that's exciting you. And eventually your new book on light. I'm sure that's going to be amazing also.
Yes, we must talk next time about some of the drugs we're working on to provide a biological mimic for light for those people who've lost their eyes.
Wow.
So we've got some very exciting data emerging there. And we should talk about that.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. So when, for myself and the audience, when can we expect this, a rough timescale on this new book?
So Penguin are hoping to publish at the beginning of 26. Amazing. So I fired the first draft. It's gone out to all my scientific mates to check for accuracy, which has been fun. They've actually given me some amazing feedback already. Lizzie, my wife, really has flagged up my appalling spellings and various other things. She's been very kind. She hasn't laughed at me much. So I'm getting the feedback now to make sure that the manuscript is fit for purpose. And as I say, I've learned so much. I mean, just next time you sit down with your mates, say, well, explain to me how light is generated in the sun.
Yeah.
And it's just so extraordinary. And this is the most important, force in our lives. And we don't know how it's made. Most of us.
I'm really looking forward to it. And so until that book comes out, I mentioned at the top of the show, my absolute favorite book on sleep, Lifetime. For everyone out there right now who maybe didn't listen to our first conversation, maybe they've never read the book before or checked out your work, where's the best place that we can point these people to check out more from yourself? Is it the book? Is there a website? Where can we tell people?
Yeah, there's the website. We've got the Sleep and Circadian Neuroscience Institute at the University of Oxford, and you can see the team and what we're up to. The book is I think still, even the paperback was published in 23, is still pretty much up to date, and it's still selling well. So I mean, Waterstones have got copies, and you can buy it online from Amazon.
Brilliant.
Probably some second-hand ones by now too.
Well, I'll make sure all those links are down below so everyone who's interested can go and check them out. Russell, thank you so much again. It's been an absolute pleasure, my friend.
For me too. Nice to speak to you again, Lou.